Welcome to Unmasking Social, where we talk about building real friendships and meaningful connections without masking who we truly are. I'm your host, Sharon Baum, a speech and language pathologist with an expertise in social thinking and how it relates to autism and ADHD, specifically with our teens and tweens. Let's dive in. In an ideal world, we're looking at the individual who is neurodivergent in all aspects of their lives, whether it's sensory regulation that manifests into behavioral disruption, or whether it's mobility difficulties, or fine motor difficulties, or expressive and receptive language, or any co-occurring learning challenges. That is the magical recipe for intervening and helping the neurodivergent individual guide us towards their journey and their path of what they want to achieve. Dr. Jeffrey Guenzel, the CEO of International Council of Development Learning, the ICDL, is joining me today to discuss how we can really implement this through the DIR Floortime model, where relationships are prioritized according to what the individual needs in all aspects, as all aspects of our individuals overlap, intertwine, and help the individual choose the path that they would like to take to create their lives. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Unmasking Social. Today, I am honored to have Jeffrey Guenzel on the podcast, who is the director of ICDL, which is the International Council for Development and Learning. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for being on the podcast with us tonight.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
So, Jeffrey, you have a long line of experience in this field. Right now, you're the director of such an important organization that really has paved the way for how we look at autism and also how we look at individuals in terms of how we treat them. As a speech and language pathologist myself, this is something that we always think about in terms of how we model for our students. Are we using neuroaffirming approaches? And I know such a big part of your work currently is DIR and DIR Floortime, which I think people sometimes get confused about. I know that people picture like kids being on the floor, but this is a philosophy that, did it develop over time for you? And can you tell us a little bit about the history of how you came to be in terms of such a big role in terms of CEO of this huge methodology and platform?
So I've done a lot of different things through my career. By trade, I'm a mental health counselor. That's my background. That's what I've been doing for the last 30 plus years. But I've gotten into leadership roles probably a good 20 years ago. I started a not-for-profit in Newark, New Jersey that continues on today, I'm happy to say. And then I left that to accept an appointment in state government in New Jersey, leading our division of child behavioral health, and then subsequently deputy commissioner, Department of Children and Families. And so it gave me a lot of opportunities at a national level and to see kind of the bigger picture of things. And I kept the clinical work going, which I absolutely love, but also got into the leadership work. And then Dr. Stanley Greenspan, who was the founding president of ICDL now 35 years ago, he passed away, and the organization was going through a transition after his passing because it really so much was centered around his brilliance and his charisma, and it didn't have an organization. And long story short, I got contacted and we connected, and I ended up getting picked to lead ICDL by the board of directors for ICDL. And I've been doing that for the last dozen years. Absolutely love what I do. To me, it's a perfect combination of incredible clinical work. And I say this very sincerely. I'm trained in so many different approaches, and Floortime and DIR as a core base and theoretical framework is the most powerful and meaningful work I've been engaged with clinically. And then from a leadership side of things, I think as an organization, we're doing good work to try to impact the world and how we think about developmental differences, how we think about development in general, not even just for individuals that are neurodivergent or have developmental differences, but for all individuals, because I think too often in our world, we get lost in things that aren't necessarily helpful. The most vulnerable in our society are often the most affected by that. So from a leadership standpoint, being able to travel all over the world, speaking at conferences and trying to shift the way people think about things, I'll say I don't mean this as a bragging thing, but I mean it as the way the impact is happening and the way the world is shifting. When I started with ICDL, we were mostly in the US with a few other countries that we had, but not real significance. We were teaching courses, I often say, in 1.5 languages. We had some Spanish, but it wasn't that great. We now teach in 24 different languages. We have people in 150 different countries that have engaged with us. It's really cool to see the shift that is happening around the world about how we think about learning and development, or development and learning, and in particular around autism, because the autism field in many ways got hijacked by one way of thinking about autism. And we're finally coming around to realize that not only is it not the only way to think about autism, but is to put it bluntly, a problematic, not very effective way to think about it, to be very direct. But, and we are, I think, on a whole, the leading developmental approach. And so people are turning to us a lot for how do we support people more developmentally?
Yeah, I could relate to you on so much of what you said, just because, first of all, clinical leadership, I had an administrative role and then I went back to clinical. So I connect with you on the fact that you still are involved in that clinical piece. You haven't just left the clinical piece and just done leadership. So you're really actively involved in this DIR Floortime methodology with individuals, which is fantastic, because I think it's so hard when you just have the leadership role and then you become a little disconnected from everything that's going on. And I also connect a lot with what you said about the approaches that can be harmful to our autistic population. And I had the luxury and the fortune of a bunch of years ago being trained in the social thinking methodology, like along the lines of social thinking, which is similar to DIR. But of course, I'd love to hear some of the differences and maybe the behavioral approaches. And listening to Stanley Greenspan, a lot of overlap in terms of looking at strengths and interests, trying to motivate the individual where they're at, meeting them where they're at, as opposed to trying to make them conform to what others are expecting of them in a world that's so nuanced. Even amongst neurotypicals, one thing this podcast has taught me is that even amongst neurotypicals, there are so many differences, and yet so many people are trying to conform to what is some standard, but the standard is just unreachable because there's so many levels of a standard and nobody can actually fulfill that. So I'm so curious, because of your long history and involvement with the population at large in terms of individuals with all sorts of developmental disabilities and now autism. When we think about this approach for our teens and tweens, right? When I think of floor time, sometimes I think of the child on the floor, right? Like floor time, like a child, right? But this approach, DIR floor time, is not just a methodology for children. It's a methodology that even teens and tweens can benefit from, right? So how can teens and tweens benefit from this so that they can build more social capacity, social energy, and ultimately build friendships and community?
I'll start by making a distinction between development and learning. And we talk about both, and the learning aspect is they both have gray area. Let's just put it that way. But I want to make some distinction from a development standpoint. We develop as humans from the bottom up. And that starts the moment we're born, and arguably before that, but the moment we're born, that developmental process begins. And the first place it starts is a relationship with other humans, right? Like it's mommy, daddy, caregiver, holding baby. And that relationship is what begins the developmental process. And that core developmental process is essential for learning. And a lot of learning, while there's aspects of learning that can be more bottom up, a lot of learning is more top down. It's things, information we learn, content that we learn, things that we're taught, which is different than the development of the human. So, for example, through pretend play, we develop a capacity for abstract thinking. And if we develop that capacity for abstract thinking in a rich, dynamic, flexible way, then learning information that requires us to be able to hold abstract representations in our mind becomes much easier. I often say, well, in training courses, you can't count past your 10 fingers if you can't hold representations in your mind in a very simplistic way. But then clearly things get much more complex. It gets much more complex than just numbers, but holding more abstract concepts. So the core ability to engage in that learning is really rooted in a developmental process that begins with relationships and human connection and more this emotional connection with the world around us. So I think that's one kind of beginning distinction to make, because what you'll see with DIR is everything is more bottom up. It's understanding how the human develops from the bottom up and really supporting that developmental process. So DIR is the theoretical framework. It's what kind of gives us an understanding of how development happens. The D are these developmental capacities that start with regulation and then go into engagement and aspects of communication, and then more into thinking and reason that continue through the lifespan. These are these developmental capacities that are very robust framework for understanding how the whole human develops. I think a lot of programs and aspects focus on pieces. So what is physical development? What is social emotional development? What is motor development? But a child, a human, is not each of these components. A human is a whole person where all of these things come together at once. And that D of DIR gives us a framework for understanding that. And then the I is understanding everyone has different ways of being. These are the individual differences, kind of getting that our individual differences interact with our development. So if an individual has motor planning differences, that can impact the way they problem solve and interact in the early developmental process. And so it's understanding, and that's where the neurodiversity aspect comes, because if you connect the D and the I, you then get unique understanding of the neurodiverse development of that individual person. And then the R is the reality that we develop in the context of relationships with other people. It's natural to the human. And then, so that framework can be applied in all sorts of ways. Floortime is the most known application, although you'll see DIR behind so many things, whether explicitly or implicitly. Like there's DIR, the work that Stanley Greenspan did, you can see in so many places. And I love it. Even when I see stuff that I'm like, I wonder if they actually saw Greenspan's work or not. And it looks just like it. And I don't mind that. In many ways, I find that it's kind of infiltrated. But so Floortime is just, how do we promote development? And Dr. Greenspan, I think one of the things about him was he named a lot of things by describing what he saw. And when he started this, he focused on younger children, understanding how the core developmental process happened. And because when he started as a child psychiatrist, the field of infant and early childhood mental health basically didn't exist. And he was one of the pioneers in the development of that. So what he saw was to meet someone in a whole body way with where they are at. If they're a young child, it's being on the floor with them. Mm-hmm. But it's about being on the floor.
Right.
It's about being the person in a genuine whole body way. And I think that whole body way is important, because I think many therapists and parents, we get lost in what we're thinking, and we try to connect at a cognitive level, and really to connect with the person and truly understand who that person is. You got to connect on a human level, which that human level is very much centered in the affective, emotional experience of being with another human, rather than necessarily what you're thinking about all of it, or what your behaviors are, or whatever that different ways of parsing that out. So for teens and tweens or adults, because we're going to do this with adults too, it's a understanding where those developmental processes are at and how to support that core developmental process. So if someone is struggling with social interactions and problem solving with someone else, a lot of programs will teach conflict resolution type strategies and teach ways to interact and problem solve. But from a developmental standpoint, those skills can have their place. But from a developmental standpoint, what we're focused on more is developing the core capacity for being in that shared social problem solving. So being able to be with someone else in that space of, you have a different idea than I have, and I'm seeking to understand idea and how it connects to mine, has a core developmental base that's kind of below the thinking of, okay, what do I exactly say? How do I get my point across? It's about being in that moment with someone. And so we can recreate those situations with cars and trucks on the floor, or and even sitting at a table or doing interactive engagement in problem solving things that aren't about so much the problem of the thing. Like we often say, it's not about manipulating the toy or figuring out a puzzle gets together. It's about the social shared part. It's about you and I doing this together, you and I interacting with each other's ideas. And really the way we develop that capacity is just by being in it with someone else. And the more we develop that capacity, then if we deploy techniques, let's say more cognitive behavioral kind of techniques of, in this situation, I'm going to use this strategy, those will work much better and be accessible if the core foundation is developed. But if the core foundation isn't developed, a lot of times those strategies either aren't accessible or people can reach to grab them for a short period and kind of like swimming across a pool, holding your breath, going underwater. They can make it, but to eat it again and do it on a regular basis is nearly impossible. And so it's building that core developmental process. And we can do that at any age, and especially easily into the early 30s. The brain keeps supporting that development. I think people shift gears way too early on focusing on, we got to teach skills, even with adolescence and transition planning into adulthood. There's a lot of times where if we just invest a little more in that developmental process, we'll get much further than trying to teach the skills. Because then when we're just trying to teach from the top down, I think some of the messaging can be, okay, we've gone as far as we can from the bottom up. Let's just see what we can do to teach skills. And it's got to be, you can do both at the same time. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but we have to keep that developmental process moving. Otherwise, we're going to end up with very fragmented kind of development, and people, kids, teens, even adults feeling like I'm not good enough, like holding that sense of I can't quite do this. And people are teaching me skills, but I still can't do it. And some of that, I put the responsibility on the professionals for that more, because I think sometimes we go too fast to, I don't know if that all makes sense. I'm babbling on here, but.
No, this actually is speaking straight to my heart, because that is the core of the podcast and the core of how my brain shifted. And I'm so glad that you're traveling around the world and that you're actually sharing this, because it does have a lot of similarities with how I was retrained, right? Because as a speech and language pathologist, we go to school and we're taught about this social pragmatic element, and we're taught about individuals that have social communication challenges, whether they have autism or not. And we're taught to teach, right? We're taught to teach. This is a skill. This is how we teach the skill. And then after a couple of years, there was a program here in New York City, which I speak about on my podcast sometimes, that made me, actually forced me to actually rethink what social really is, which is similar to what you're saying in the sense of, okay, well, this is where the person is at. First of all, what are their strengths and interests? What's going to motivate them? Where are they at in their social development? And also, we can't tell them, oh, like you said, here's the situation, here's the problem. Okay, so what should we do to solve it? A, B, or C, right? Like you said, that's not retainable information. I mean, it's not like you're reading a script for theatrical performance. Unfortunately, they speak a lot about the episodic memory and the weakness in remembering episodes and things that happen and trying to change the outcome, but you can't learn in a way where you're going to continue the same outcome all over again and then just continue to be upset and dysregulated, because that would be the opposite of what you're saying, which is social relationships, really focusing on social relationships. And like you gave an example of, okay, you don't necessarily have to be on the floor, because when I think of DIR, for some reason, I don't know, maybe it's just my brain, I think of floor time to be like tummy time, right? Like the kid is just sitting on the floor rolling around. But that's not really what it is. You explained it well. Actually, it's just meeting them where they're at. So if they're a child, right, then you may be on the floor with them and they may be engaging with play. And that's their first step of development towards social. whether it's reciprocal play with somebody else or just playing by themselves, right, in the beginning, and then engaging with the toy. That's obviously joint attention. But then moving on to, as they become teens and tweens, like you said, having people sit together to problem solve rather than telling them, this is what you do, here are the options. So I very much understand where you're coming from. I'm so glad that you're sharing this with more and more people, because I don't know, in my mind, I surround myself with people that think like this. So because of that, I don't realize that so much of the world probably doesn't really know that yet, just because they haven't been trained in it on some level.
And relationships are hard to pinpoint. Like, we like programs that give us structure, that give us techniques, give us strategies. And there's a place for all of that. It's not that there's not, but a lot of that doesn't work well unless you've built that core foundation. So, for example, in the autism diagnosis, there's one line of the diagnostic criteria that says, I think it uses the word deficits because it's a diagnostic manual, but deficits or challenges in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. And I often talk about that because for the average person, the capacity to develop, maintain, and understand relationships did not develop by someone teaching you a skill of how to do it. It developed by being in a relationship with another person or other people. And it developed over time through those repeated relationships and that engagement. Yet when we get a diagnosis and it becomes part of the deficit that gets identified, and I was doing quotes, I wasn't quite on video there because I don't like the deficit.
Yeah, for anybody who's listening and not watching, it's in quotes. Yeah.
But as soon as it gets identified as a diagnosis, suddenly people get the strategy book out of, okay, how are we going to teach this? How are we going to fix it? And it's like, I think that it's with good intention that people do, but it ends up missing the boat. And that's where developmentally we do so much of just being in these rich relationships and in the therapeutic process, being in the relationship from a language acquisition tip. I just did a presentation at a national conference in Australia. And I asked ChatGPT for a picture of a mom and a son playing with a yellow ball. And ChatGPT gave me this picture of mom and son and this yellow ball in the middle. They were smiling, like big smiles. They weren't quite looking at each other because ChatGPT can't quite figure out that. But you could see the love, the engagement, the connection. And I said, give me a picture with the same two where mom is teaching the child the color yellow using the yellow ball. It was remarkable how ChatGPT knew what that meant. And it showed mom with more of this stern look on her face of kind of holding the ball out towards the child. The child was sitting on the couch with this grimace, angry look on his face.
Oh.
And I was like, my example in the conference was, what 5-year-old holds up a yellow ball to another 5-year-old and says, say yellow, say yellow.
Right.
It doesn't happen. And we're playing with that yellow ball. We're engaging with the joy of it. And that's where meaning comes from, because the meaning of what is a yellow ball to me actually is different than the meaning of what a yellow ball is to you. And that is so important, even though our definition of yellow technically may be the same. It's a color on the wheel or whatever, but it has a very different meaning for each one of us. And even ball will have a different meaning for each one of us. And what we see as positive, negative, scary, happy, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But that, these organic interactions, and we can, what I would say from a Floortime standpoint is we can do all of that very intentionally. And we can build those developmental capacities intentionally without necessarily getting out the strategy book. Like, Floortime is very, like, there's things that we do and how we do it. And it's about promoting development. We're serious about that. You can be strength-based, you can be neuroaffirming, and you still can kind of push for that developmental process to happen and take it very seriously and live up to our responsibility as professionals and parents to help those in our care grow and develop. Like, it's not, we're going to be all kind and nice and not do that. Like, you can do both at the same time, but that organic, joyful, affectively rich interaction is just so good for us as humans. And it works so well to get that developmental process cooking. So that's what we're doing in Floortime. And that works. I don't care if you're talking about an 8-year-old or an 80-year-old or an 8-month-old or an 80-year-old. Like, there's research to show that relationships are really important for keeping the brain cooking late in life and is associated with later brain decline and memory loss and things like that when people have those relationships later in life.
Yeah, you touched upon a couple of things that I'd love to follow up on. First is you mentioned joy and meaning and finding meaning through joy. You're the mental health expert here. I have a background in psychology, but just an undergrad degree. But you really have so much experience in that mental health piece. And one of the things I remember learning about when I was working in this program for many years is that how do we find joy in our social experiences? And then you mentioned how you ChatGPT'd that picture and the individual was grimacing. And now they're making an association with social, it sounds like, as a very depressing, not fun experience. So it sounds like what you're saying is that it's important that we allow our individuals with autism, ADHD, whatever it may be, to find joy in the experiences that they're having. But that can only happen if A, we meet them where they are, and B, we also meet them in their area of interest and things that excite them, right? And the other thing that you touched upon was also that, and I know Dr. Greenspan also you touched upon it, is you keep looking at the individual as a whole as opposed to different parts. And so it's interesting because a lot of these individuals get so many different types of support. A lot of them will get speech and language therapy, occupational therapy for the regulation piece. They'll also get some sort of special education support from a special education teacher that's trained, sometimes physical therapy and everything. So does DIR blend all of these things together in a way where one person can really look at all those things and help the child, such as the parent, the family, or maybe just a professional?
So yes and no. I mean, I think the framework, we often talk about it being transdisciplinary. And the reason we use transdisciplinary instead of interdisciplinary is really think about interdisciplinary being professionals working alongside each other, communicating well, making good plans together. But transdisciplinary kind of takes it one step further where you see the whole person and you even learn more about, I often use myself as an example as far as sensory processing. I have a good working knowledge of sensory processing. I see a lot of kids from the mental health side that have anxiety-related issues that many mental health professionals, I think, miss the sensory aspect of it because that's not where they're trained, and they go more cognitive behavioral to address the anxiety, which I would argue could actually make things worse if sensory is kind of the core.
Okay.
But I'll never treat sensory processing. That's not what I do. But a good floor time process, no matter what professional is doing it or if the parent is doing it, can help address all of that at one time. The last family I recently worked with that I just interviewed for my presentation that I did, it was about, I guess now 2 weeks ago in Australia. I interviewed the dad of the couple, and the dad, they had 8 months of speech therapy before they came to me and some folks within ICDL. And they had 8 months of speech therapy, and the speech therapist the dad referred to the speech therapist as using ABA. I'm not sure if they were really ABA trained, but they definitely were using more of a behavioral kind of idea. He described them holding up a cup and say, this is a cup, because teaching yes or no. Yes, it's a cup. No, this is a train. No, it's not a train. Like that kind of training. 8 months went by, I never said yes or no. And with a few days with us, he said his son was speaking, and I guess it was his son at that time was about 3, was speaking more after 3 days than 8 months of speech therapy. And it's not that the speech therapy was bad, and what he described was there was no speech therapist there. There was a educator and an OT actually at that happened working with him and me in the background. But it was about connecting the whole body. So we connect the motor, we connect the emotion, and we connect the communication. And we understand that communication is a lot more, as you well know, a lot more than just the words, right?
Yes,
and what is all of that that's not the words? experience of the communication, a lot of the affective experience of it. And so there's a yes or no to your core question. Yes, it is about everyone working with the whole person. And I think a single person that really gets the whole concept can do a lot of really good work. At the same time, I'm always careful because especially autistic individuals have lots of co-occurring dynamics where
Yes.
very specific targeted support can be very helpful as long as that person understands the bigger picture. Because I think one of the biggest challenges that many of our autistic and neurodivergent individuals have is already experience the world in somewhat of a kind of siloed way, like experiencing this in a real intense way, and it's disconnected from another experience and how they collide and struggle to integrate. And then we do therapy that just reinforces that or separates that more, where if we can really bring that experience together, that emotion can connect with that communication, that can connect with that behavior, that can connect to that cognition, that it all can come together in a smooth way, we end up addressing multiple things at one time, even if that's not. So I hope that answers your question, because I'm a little careful with, yes, one person could do it all, because I think there's an absolute role in place for specialty, but we have to be so careful of going down that road of specialty because it often leads to very siloed thinking, and that's not helpful.
And so I think that actually you make a good point, because instead of one person can do it all, how about each person can do it all? Like each individual, let's say the speech pathologist, the occupational therapist should be looking at the whole thing, should be looking at the co-occurring things and collaborating together. So let's avoid the siloing. Let's make sure that everybody's working together in a group so that we make sure that we're looking at every aspect, because there are so many co-occurring things. And in my experience, one of the big things, and you touched upon it, was the sensory piece, the dysregulation, the anxiety that I've always seen results from dysregulation, where this overstimulation of the senses, just integrating all the different noises, the touch, all the five senses, and that integration piece has just led so many of my teens and tweens along the years to feel just like out of their own body, almost like not feeling comfortable in their own skin. Some of them have reported. So I'm curious, because you mentioned that sometimes people will go the CBT route, which you don't necessarily think will help because sensory is rooted in a different kind of system, not necessarily anxiety. It causes anxiety, but it's not necessarily rooted in the mental health area.
Mm-hmm.
So what can DIR do to help this sensory dysregulation, which also sometimes leads to this, what people call a behavioral disruption, when in fact, the child is trying to react. So I'm just curious how DIR addresses this, if there's a direct approach, if there's a more holistic approach, just in terms of focusing on this piece, which I think really interferes with ultimately the social connection.
So I think you'll appreciate this as a speech therapist. Our board president, Emil Hose, who's now has his doctorate. So Dr. Emil Hose, to give him his props, but he's now in his early 30s, 30 or 31, and that around there. He didn't speak a spoken word until he was 15 years old. And
Wow.
he's very talkative now. He and I do not have short meetings together, but he describes the main reason that he did not communicate verbally with others was because of sensory overload. Not because he didn't want to communicate, not because he necessarily couldn't communicate. That's what everyone assumed, and that's what everyone thought about him. But it really rooted much more mostly in the sensory experience of his world and constantly being in this overwhelmed, overloaded place. And so DIR, definitely from a regulation standpoint, that's the foundation. And regulation isn't just sensory. It is much more than just sensory, but sensory for many neurodivergent individuals is a centerpiece of it. But it interconnects with emotional regulation. It interconnects with other aspects of the subcortical driven regulation of just being okay kind of in your own skin. But clearly sensory is a big one. And without that core regulation, it's hard to engage in anything else. And the reality is people try to understand sensory, and even well-intended people, I think, struggle significantly with understanding how much it impacts things. And even, I think most people will talk about some of the sensory systems, but not really get like our vestibular system, proprioceptive, interoception, even how we experience pain. Like there's so much that people don't really fully understand, and how central it is to the experience of just being okay and feeling safe. Because our sensory systems are there in part to keep us alive, to protect
You're
us.
right.
And if we get messages that it's a dangerous world, you're going to see big behaviors.
Yeah.
Or you're going to see real shutdown. That's where some of the communication, how it totally can connect to communication, is if you're not well regulated, it is hard to engage in any form of meaningful communication. And if someone just sits with you to try to kind of force the issue without attending to the regulation, most likely you're just going to see more either shutdown or fight or flight kind of responses. And again, what you'll get is maybe some fragmented success that the therapist can check a box here and there that the person did this or did that, but you're really not going to get meaningful or respectful development happen without attending to and understanding the regulation. And I think one of the biggest things is the understanding. I go back to 30 plus years of being a therapist and all the different things I've learned. The single most important thing is that a person in front of you truly is understood by you. I think that's one of the best gifts we can give to another human, is just the gift of understanding. And when that person feels and knows they're understood, because it's more than just a feeling, because I think sometimes when people talk about feeling understood, it can have an artificial nature of, well, I'm going to make them feel like, but a real genuine that person knows that you get them, because there's not much more important than having at least one person in our life that gets us, right? Like,
yeah. We all need that.
Yeah. And part of that is getting that regulation and understanding how that works. Because it's hard to have empathy for something. And I don't mean everything in the sense of like the compassion and caring. I mean like truly of walking in someone's shoes when you never have experienced that. It is hard. And it takes a lot of humility and openness to gain that sense of understanding with someone that has a sensory experience that's very different, or a motor experience, or like there's other things that can, but sensory is definitely a big one.
First of all, that is just so powerful. A couple of things you just said. One is that the individual who has a big role in that you can't stop talking now. I forget what his name is. He's the president, right?
Neil is.
And exactly. And this happens so much with the late talkers, where eventually they just don't stop talking, and the parents were wishing for them to talk, and then they don't know how to get them to stop. But it's crazy to think that it was literally until he was 15 years old, you said, that he didn't talk at all, and then spoke. And he said that he attributes all of that to the fact that he was just completely dysregulated, which is why I always come back to this, because I don't think, like you said, a lot of people feel like they're being understood or know that they're being understood, right? Feeling is different, but know that they're being understood. And a lot of times I found that a lot of the neurodivergent individuals that I've worked with can see through that. They can see through you much more than the non-neurodivergent. They have this really, really good BS detector that I think is just like spot on, whether or not you're really trying to understand them or not. So it seems like the best way to avoid what happened to Emil, which is 15 years of just struggling in his own body and therefore not communicating, is to really approach the individual and try to understand through observing them, observing their interactions, observing what is causing them to be dysregulated, observing what are the things that are triggering them or setting them off, so that you guys can work together on a way to figure out ways to help them get regulated, whether it's the simple headphone, right, that I'm wearing now for the loud noises, or whether it's taking breaks, I guess, right, because they need fresh air just because there's just too much going on in the room. Unfortunately, schools aren't designed for this a lot, but going to a separate room when things are a lot to take in. I mean, sometimes I walk into classrooms and I'm so overstimulated myself. Like, I feel like I need to exit the room. So I can only imagine what that feels like for somebody else. But then you also mentioned something interesting about individuals at their core. I forgot the quote that you just said, but you said a really good quote that individuals don't want to feel understood. They don't want you to say that you feel like you understand them. They want to know that you actually understand them, right?
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
that's part of the whole framework, is demonstrating that you actually understand them, right? So what would you say through this framework is the best way of showing these individuals that you are neuroaffirming, that you do understand them, that you understand that there are differences that they have, and that you're in their corner cheering them on without actually saying it out loud?
So one thing is, and this goes back, even though it's a little bit misnomer to say floor time because it's not on the floor,
Right.
but that whole idea of genuinely meeting someone in a whole body way where they are at. And like if you're a therapist or a parent, letting go of your thoughts of where you want this to go, where you expect it to go, like, we spend so much time in this cerebral world when we be with the person that's right in front of us. And that's important. It's not that, but in the moment, there's a certain amount you have to let go of that and really, truly join with the person in front of you or that you're with. And so it's really a willingness to do that and to respect them, that their developmental journey may be different. Like Emil, and you don't know Emil's background and his story, but in many ways, his mom did so many things that was against what everyone said. And she went much more developmental. She didn't really know what she was doing and didn't have a lot of support 25 years ago. But basically, I think part of it was that was part of his developmental journey. And talking at 15, I think a lot of times parents get sold this artificially developed agenda that if we don't do this by this age, it's not going to happen. And I want parents to be urgent and work hard with their kids. At the same time, you have to respect the developmental process of each person and know that if you keep just helping them grow and develop, the next thing will come. And I think his mom got that. And his mom just kept kind of pushing things along and providing the support and keeping it moving. And slowly he was able to get to a regulated place and he was able to experience the world in a full way. He's now, very successful in so many ways. He's married to a wonderful autistic woman. They have a wonderful family with her. It's just, they're beautiful, beautiful, wonderful, wonderful people that have a meaningful in the world. And Emil is having a significant, people are going to hear more and more about Emil with time because he's turning into a heavy hitter, self-advocate or disability advocate. But I think part of it is respecting that they're on their journey and I appreciate the privilege to be on that journey with them. And that it's not my journey, it's their journey. And my job is to help that journey be what they want it to be, to help their life, to help in whatever way I can help them avoid challenges or get through challenges. Like I want to be there as walking with them, but not pulling them along. Like if you go into a school and you see the difference between a floor-time therapist and a non-floor-time therapist, oftentimes if you put me in a school and watched a speech therapist and OTs do pull out, one of the big differences you'll see is the floor-time therapist, the child will typically take the therapist's hand and walk them out of the classroom. Or the therapist having to take the child's hand and walk them out. And it's an important difference. There's plenty of therapists that don't do floor time that the kids love, but it is a shift. And it's one that I mentioned specifically because there was a therapist that was trying to get her colleagues to see things differently. And finally, one day, that's what they asked her. Why do the children always take your hand? And we always have to grab their hand. And that was the bit. And it seems simple, but it's real. It's real.
But that really sums it up, really, because it's basically them guiding you towards what they want on their journey, whatever that may be. Obviously, there are boundaries that are going to be set with children, right? We don't want anybody to be in a dangerous situation. So we're not saying that, okay, let the child do whatever they want, but within the context of allowing the freedom, but allowing ourselves to be flexible. Because you pointed out that a lot of times we have a plan. And the thing is that there is no plan. When you get into a session or you work with these children, I find that whatever plan you had set up, you're going to have to scratch that plan. And so that requires a lot of flexibility, I feel like, on the side of the therapist or the teacher or the parent, because we want our plan sometimes to go through just like in a rigid way, even though we don't want them to be rigid, right? And so everything, but then we're being rigid with the plan. What?
I said, it's funny how it works. We do exactly what we don't want.
Right. Because we're teaching self-awareness, but sometimes we're not self-aware. It just happens. But I just feel like that's just such a big part of it. It's just stepping back and thinking, wait a second, okay, the plan's not going to go as planned, just like it won't go for the child or the teen and tween. They have a plan and their plan's going to get messy. Our plan's going to get messy. What we intended or what we thought we were going to maybe work on with them is going to get derailed because suddenly we're going to learn something new, and that's okay. And then we're going to have to shift, and we're going to have to pivot, and we're going to have to change what we were working on because we're adapting to what they really want. So I always found that the best sessions were the ones that got really messy, even though people were going in many different directions, but allowing for that, allowing for different directions to be taken and not saying, okay, this is step 1 of today. This is my whiteboard, step 2, step 3, step 4. No, we're going to try to do this. Let's see how it works. And then let's see something else. But I love that image. And for anybody who's listening, I feel like they can really resonate with that, whether it's a neurodivergent individual, a family member, or a professional. But that image that you created of the child holding the hand of the clinician and guiding them. I think that is so amazing because that really what it is. It's really just guiding you to help them. They want to be helped. They want to advocate for themselves. That's true advocacy. Here you are. I'll walk you out and I'll lead the way. And then you'll support me on the journey through, essentially.
Well, there was a white paper done by the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network that we worked with them, and they did the developing mostly, and we provided some support. But it's entitled For Whose Benefit? And the reason they picked that title is because so much of autism therapies are really, you have to question who it's for. Is it for helping the quality of life of the autistic person? Or is it in some way trying to help the quality of life for the people around the autistic person? And I think that's part of this dynamic of following the lead and really being there, because we have awesome power and control as therapists, as teachers, as parents, but to use that power and control to create safety and security and a place that is okay to try on new things and to grow and develop, but not use that power and control to say, well, and I know we don't say it out loud, but there's a lot of autistic adults that have experienced, and they talk about this, that they couldn't say no, that the power and control was used to control them and get them to do things that wasn't comfortable or was even beyond not comfortable, was harmful or painful. And what they developed was this understanding that if someone is bigger and has more power over me, I can't say no. And then we wonder why more autistic people are victims of abuse and situations like that. And what role did we play in creating it by saying someone bigger and stronger and more powerful you can ignore your no? A cycle that is dangerous. And I think one that we can use our power control in such a positive way. Like kids need to know, and I think even teenagers need to know that the adult around them is keeping them safe, is watching out for them.
And if they're not, then they should be speaking up, because I think a lot of them don't advocate when they don't feel safe or secure, because like you said, they've been taught, no, just say, go along with it. Just go along with it. So
can I tell you, when I had my practice, I had a private practice for a few years, and I would get a lot of angry boys, preteen, teen boys, that the parents would bring into me. And I think part of it was they were hopeful that, honestly, like a male therapist, they were looking for a male therapist that could deal with their angry son. And they thought somehow I would have some.
Yeah.
Like I think there was some stereotyping going on, but that's okay. It's
no, sometimes
I understand
it can work well. No, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I'll tell you, I learned very quickly that once I got a little bit of connection, one of the things I would ask the boys was, how many people in your life tell you you're broken and need to be fixed? And I'll tell you, it was so disheartening how they would just list off people, and people that were there to care for them, that had good intention, but the messaging that they were getting, that they were broken and need to be fixed. And that is hard to live with in any ongoing basis. We all need people that we can trust, that can tell us. I often joke that's part of marriage, right? To have one person and to tell you when you're broken. But like, we all need someone or people to give us that information once in a while. But if that's what we experience on an ongoing basis, that is just extremely detrimental to the psychological well-being. Depression, anxiety definitely will follow suit, or aggressive, angry, like people talk about, what do I do about an aggressive behavior? A lot of the aggressive behaviors have so many things that developmentally are part of where they got to. And yes, we have to deal with the aggressive behavior, and it's probably going to be more behavioral response, but we got to connect with the human and figure out how we help them fully engage with the world in ways that respects them as an authentic human, in ways that I think a lot of our systems struggle with.
That really is disheartening to hear, because I just feel just anybody in general being told, or even not even directly, whether it was explicitly or implicitly, that they're broken and they need fixing. I mean, I feel like that can last with that person forever. And they start believing they're broken. And once you start believing you're broken, like you said, then there's aggression and everything follows suits. And so therefore, this whole approach is the opposite of that, which is basically telling the individual, oh, where are you? Where are you at? Oh, observing where they're at, and then trying to work with them, collaborate with them on, like you said, their journey, guiding them through. And there's no fixing. There's nothing to fix, right? It's more about just helping them face whatever challenges they choose to face. If they want to take the mask off, great. We spoke about masking a bit before, and sometimes they don't have to take the mask off either. It depends on their mask meter, as somebody put it on. Dr. Stephen Shore was on the podcast, and he mentioned that sometimes the mask meter is going to be on because it's just too hard to take off for that moment, because on the level of anxiety, it's going to go up to here if they take it off. So really just allowing them to be themselves, I think, is really right. The key point here is working together holistically, allowing them to be themselves. And I really love the fact that, because this has been asked a number of times, not just on this podcast, but off the podcast, that this work was also rooted in the fact that there isn't going to be formal assessments of this child, right? We're not trying to formally assess social of the individual. We're trying to just observe them in their natural context.
I think in so many ways, I think it's a balance, because we all have things that are challenges for us, and having people understand those can be really important. But at the same time, we can understand that yet still be very strength-based, still be very supportive, and help them become their authentic selves without saying, this is who you're supposed to be, and find that balance. Because it's all about finding that right balance of, I'm here either as a parent or as a professional to help you move forward, but how do you want to move forward? And where is your strengths? Because I've heard so many stories from parents that they missed kind of their child's passion. And when they figured it out, everything opened up. Like
Yeah.
But we miss it because I actually think most of the time it's the professionals that kind of push that on the parents more than the parents. I think sometimes the professionals will blame the parents, but when I go back and look at what those parents experienced for the 7 years before they got to that professional, I'm like, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
It's we're the ones a lot of times that are pushing these things that we need to question.
Well, because the fixed interest concept, right? Where it's this fixed interest that we have to get rid of because this is contributing to the individual being broken, when really all of these special interests and these passions that my students have had have led to them to go into careers. And if they didn't choose a career, a certain path that was based on their passion. So I feel like it's important to harness those passions, because the kid that's building the Legos for 8 hours is going to be maybe the kid that's also going to be building or contributing to the skyscraper in New York City. I'm just saying that because I live here in New York City. So yeah, I mean, I can't say enough that how much I agree with you on that, and how we miss it a lot. We miss it a lot with the passions. Just one last thing I just want to touch upon. I know that you travel a lot, and I also know that you are trying to create a world where it is neuroaffirming and that we are supporting the individuals at large.
People often focus on the cultural differences and aspects of how humans around the world are different, and they are, and there's really neat and meaningful differences from a cultural standpoint. But I will say that at the core, humans are about relationships with other humans. And there's so much that is absolutely the same, and that as far as how the core of how we develop as humans is so similar. And I go in with lots of cultural humility that works even much better than trying to be perfectly competent and understand everything. But the process of human development is not vastly different from one culture to the next. And while you might see differences in, okay, this culture looks like they're less affectively expressive, and this culture looks like they're much more affectively expressive. It's not that it lacks the affective expression, it's just communicated differently and experienced differently, but it's still part of the human development process. So it's interesting because I find the more that I've now been to, not as much as Stephen Shore, he's got about double me. But
he said his favorite places on the airplane. I said, what was his most favorite thing he's done recently? And he said, just hanging out on the planes. So been to like 72 countries, but yeah.
Yeah, he and I are well connected. We're friends, and he's an advisor for ICDL. And we joke a lot about places we've been. And I had a give him a hard time last week because Tasmania, or 2 weeks ago, because Tasmania, he has not been to Tasmania yet, which is part of Australia, but he's been to Australia a bunch of times. But
not Tasmania. That Tasmanian devil. He has
Tasmania. I got one little one on him. That's all I got.
Right.
But,
yeah.
And I don't think he's been to Haiti. I've been to Haiti. I did work.
Oh, you've been to Haiti? Oh, wow. So Dr. Stephen Shore, if you're listening to this, you haven't been to 80 countries yet. Sorry.
But Stephen Shore is one of my favorite people. I think he's
wonderful.
Amazing. And in the end, when you listen to his story about his family and what his parents did, while they didn't know Floortime and it wasn't really a thing yet, so to speak, basically what they did was very Floortime centered. It was about, instead of trying to get him to imitate them, it was imitating him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was joining in his world rather than trying to pull him into their world. And again, whose hands holding who and who's pulling or pushing, like they gave him the opportunity to be the one that they were going to follow.
As I've just met more people throughout this journey of my own, I see that this approach, wherever you are in the world, is something that everybody can speak to. And I love how there is some cultural humility, but at the same time, you're coming in with the same ideas and the same approaches that work with the same people, because social communication is social communication with some cultural differences. But yeah, so I think that this is going to be such a powerful episode. Thank you so much for sharing your time. I think there's just like so many important perspectives on here that people can appreciate. Again, just because this podcast always goes back to neuroaffirming in terms of not just the buzzword neuroaffirming. How are we going to let individuals who are autistic or ADHD, teens and tweens, or even children help guide us so that they can achieve what they need to achieve? So thank you for sharing all the stories, all the experiences that have been shaped by so many years of such critical experience. As a CEO of ICDL, I mean, you're just such a powerful voice for the people who need that voice. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to have the conversation.